did the traditional path, and I found myself changing areas I didn't want to change just to be accepted. I found a lot of agents, and this is their job. They look at you and they say, this is the market. These are the books that are going to be sold. If I'm going to represent you and really pitch this idea, it has to align with the market.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writing Our Own Story, the StoryForge podcast. If you are new to us, StoryForge is a reading and writing platform that is dedicated to change in the publishing industry. We are accepting of peoples of all races, backgrounds, genders, sexualities, and identities. If you're not familiar with us, please join. We'll put a link in the bio. There is a referral code that you can use for listening to this podcast. Will get you a free additional 50 quills, which will allow you to purchase even more stuff for your library home screen. My name is Tim. I'm the Director of Operations here at StoryForge. I will be your host today. Joining me is Beatrice, who is the Senior Director of Marketing. And our special guest for today is Sarah Al-Serhaid. I said that correctly? Yes. That was my big worry. Who is the author of Etched in Stone and also a scientist, which I'm going to say it on camera because we got to record it. Like we kind of fangirled a little bit when you said you were interested to be on this. So tell us a little bit about Etched in Stone and then tell us a little bit about the science work you do because it's super interesting stuff.
Okay, so Etched in Stone is a story. It's got multiple parts going to it, but it's a story about two young girls who find out that their family has a long, long, long secret and or a history of secrets, and they uncover them one by one to discover who they really, really are. And all the wonderful stuff that happens after that. The big point of Etched in Stone is okay, now what? And then now what can not necessarily be so great consequences or a big deal. At least that's the scientist in me, that we have to be very realistic in the fact that you can't have ultimate cosmic power and have not a little itty bitty living space. That's a Disney reference. I
Yeah,
hope
I gotcha.
somebody picked that up.
Oh, I got it.
Um,
Aladdin, the
yeah.
great one.
So there's always going to be consequences, both good or bad. And I try to keep that in everything that I do, but it's the main focal point of Jade and Amber and their journey, and they have their power and what comes with it. As for being a scientist, ooh, I guess this story came out from me being a scientist. There are certain assays and experiments that, at least for me, I can't think too much about it. Once I've made my experimental plan, I have to just zone everything out and work. But my brain still wants to keep going. And so I'll give it a topic to think about that's not going to interfere with my calculations or what I'm doing. And all the nitty gritty details of the story came out in the many, many, many essays that I've been doing.
So how does this background of being a scientist and I'm going to quote your website. You research the molecular triggers for preterm labor as a women's health initiative. Like, does that blend into your writing? Do you want it to? Do you how do you keep it separate then? Because so many people
Um,
are like they want to be a writer, but they have to work a day job to pay for that. So,
so it took me a while to come to terms with the fact that I'm going to use an analogy. And if you've read the book, you'll know which character I'm referring to with these analogies. But when you blow bubbles, each bubble is its own little pocket of air and it's got its boundary and it bounces all over and it has its little life as a bubble. Bubbles can bounce off each other, they can stick to one another, they can sometimes merge. And these boundaries are it took me a while to figure out, but those are just what's really, really important. As a scientist, there's a lot of skills and discipline that I need that it may help me as an author, but I don't need it. And that's a bubble, it's going to fly on its own. It can bounce off being an author. They can stick for some time, but they're never going to converge, at least for the work that I do and the stories that I'm writing currently. That may change in the future. It's nice to be flexible, but as of right now, I like to keep every part of my life in its bubble. And if it needs to be flexible and bounce off another idea or stick to another, that's okay. Sometimes they have to merge. It works fine. But as long as everybody or every idea knows that if you're scientist is here, authorship is here, family is here, personal time is here, it helps at least keep me grounded in what I'm doing and stay focused.
That is the most
How
beautiful analogy for like keeping things separated I have ever seen in my life.
yeah, that was really good. But so I mean, you have all the bubbles floating in the air to use your own analogy. Like, do you have to like try to set boundaries for certain ones? Because like obviously, you can maybe be thinking about, your writing during certain things, maybe not while you're running experiments, but like how do you juggle all of that? Because we have part-time writers, we have students, we have business professionals who just want to be authors. Like how do you balance that and still be able to produce a novel?
So it takes practice, trial and error, but to know the boundaries and the parameters of your work. So, for example, for me as a scientist, my boss and the PI of our lab is very flexible and understanding. He understands all the other different parts of my life, and he gives me that flexibility in return for my dedication to my work. So, there are days that I am in the lab until 10, 11 o'clock p.m. because the
Oof.
experiment or the assay requires that of me. And in return, I'm not going to come in at 8 a.m. or I'm not going to come in at that specific timeline. Um, when I had my second child, I talked to my PIs like, I really would like to switch to part time. I'm still going to maintain all of my managerial aspects since I'm the lab manager. And I will have my science projects, but obviously it's going to have to scale back because I want to make sure that I have some time at home with my son and give him that dedication that I have.
Hmm.
And he was fully understanding, didn't have to say anything beyond that. The whole speech that I had out the window, didn't need it, very understanding, very flexible. And so it's like, okay, we can work with this. And yes, again, still while I'm as a part-time scientist, I still am late in the lab some days. And then there are days I have to do a podcast and I'm going to come into work an hour or two late. And we all understand each other as long as we communicate. I'm always technically working. My phone's always getting
Hmm.
messages from, hey, I had to do this. What did you do? We're running protocols against each other. It's fine. My husband's very understanding, and I give and take just like as he gives and takes. It's something that we have a conversation about. We set parameters. I guess that's the scientist in me. I will very much write everything down. We'll sit down. We'll treat our family conversation like it's a meeting, and we're going to have an agenda. And he's a project manager, so that actually works very well. And we'll write our goals and our tasks. And okay, so within 3 months, this is what we want, and we will follow back and circle back. But to be honest, it's taken time to get here. Like
Hmm.
I first pitched Etched in Stone like in 2022, and at that point, I had no idea what I was doing. So the trial and error part comes through, and I've heard advice from people that has worked, and I'll take it. And there's some other pieces of advice that I go, "That's a new thing," and thank you for sharing.
So tell us about that journey of trying to get published, because that's everyone's ultimate
Mhm.
goal is to get published. Some people they manage it, some people they don't, some people publish independently. Um, Tell us about your journey to get published.
Personally, for me, I did a hybrid publishing program with my publisher Kohler in Virginia in the United States. I submitted my story to several other companies, and the terms of the contract that most resonated with me was with Kohler, and we were able to move forward. I learned about hybrid publishing and what it really means to be hybrid rather than a vanity press through a book coach that helped me get an outline for my book. So originally, Etched in Stone was over 280,000 words. I still have the binder at home to remind me of the chaotic nights in the lab really can be a really long and repetitive story at times. And you have to kill your darlings. You got to make sure that the story has a beginning, middle, and end. And when I learned how to do that, and it wasn't exactly easy, but it was so worth it to take the self criticism and move forward and then build that final copy just to submit because there's definitely edits after that. We had a conversation, we put a deadline, I signed a contract, and then I met with the editors. And while they were very forthcoming and very educational and very informative, I don't know if it's in me or not, but I needed to learn on my own. So I decided to, like, what if I wanted to self publish? What would I do? And I looked online, and there's a lot of resources out there. It can get overwhelming. Little by little, I learned, okay, I definitely for the second book, I'm probably going to self publish, and I've already got a plan on how that's going to happen based on what other people said they've worked, based on the genre, based on the story. Um, But for me, for the first book, just to have a publisher behind me that knows what they're doing, that the editors were able to teach me some of the quirks. They're like, okay, so why is this like that? Why is that like that? I learned a lot. They learned about my story. And we have a product, and it's still a learning process a little
Yeah.
bit, but it's a
So
good one, I think.
what was the defining factor that pushed you to lean into self-publishing for your second book?
Um, that so the benefit of having a book coach, at least for me, was that she told us or taught the entire cohort that there are two reasons that you choose a publisher or you choose a publishing model, and that is speed to market and control of your creativity. And she wanted to teach us that to make sure that money was never a factor if you're looking for quality. And so from the very beginning, I'd answer a question of how quickly do I want this book to get to market and how much control do I want over what's going on inside that. And based on answering those two questions, I knew that traditional publishing wasn't going to be an easy path for me because one, the speed to market would be much longer and I wouldn't have as much control over the story, the cover, the editing. Um, so now that I know a little bit about what I'm doing, I think I'm a little more confident to do self-publishing. If I knew what I knew now back then, I probably would have self-published Etched in
Okay.
Stone. But now that I know a little bit of what's going on, that trial and error, I think I'm a little more confident to say I'm going to go ahead and do this plan. I'm very happy that if I get a little scared and I need that support, I can always come back and maybe we can work up another contract. But based on my timeline of speed to market of how soon I want that second book to come out, I think self-publishing is going to serve it best.
I
Okay.
think that the way that you have portrayed everything, I think it's very beautiful and it's very probably eye-opening for a lot of authors that are starting because some people see self-publishing and traditional publishing as a black or white situation. And a lot of the times they put a weight on them that is not really realistic, as in one is better than the other one. So I think coming from someone that has experience and actually has done all the research in which one of these things is specifically the better for myself and my intentions that I have with my work is going to be very, very useful for people that are not sure even what they want to do in the first place, to put them in a way that is more centered in their own goals instead of in the perception that traditional publishing like people have of traditional publish versus the perception that people have of self-publishing. I have seen a lot of discourse of people saying like, "Oh, I feel like people treat me less because I'm like independently, I'm self-published," and like the other way around, or be like, "Oh yeah, traditional publishing, everyone that traditional publishes is like the worst because they don't understand the struggle." So this very like realistic like grace approach of like it's different for everyone, I feel like it's extremely valuable, and I think it's really good for like nowadays specifically and the environment of like how the publishing industry is right now.
Yeah, I learned that the publishing industry has gone through a lot of changes, especially since 2020.
Hmm.
But I don't necessarily think it's a negative thing. Like there's always going to be somebody out there who's going to be a Debbie Downer and they're just going to bring everybody down. But what I've learned is you can build your own village. So the Instagram account that I have exclusively for the book, I follow other authors that are either hybrid, traditional. It's not a requirement for me to whether I support you or not. We're always trying to be each other's village. We help each other out. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people on the exact same platform that are going to be the negative people. And at this point in life, I think we're all old enough to know and say, you can do that. I choose to stay in this environment. I'm going to help uplift others. And in turn, they're just going to do the same for me. There's absolutely no difference between how you get a book out into market as long as it's a good story and people resonate with that. If you find your audience and they like your story, that's ultimately what matters. You get an editor, they edit. You get a book cover. Designers do that. I think if you're the type of person who enjoys that type of negative talk, you're going to stay in it. Then there's a lot of people who are like, okay, I heard you. You have an opinion. You said it. Now I'm going to go hear that person because they're a little more cheerful and I feel better when I talk to them.
I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that's the vibe we go for in Storyforge, is trying to keep that upbeat, supportive thing. But I just find it very interesting that I'm gonna keep harping on this a little bit. Like you went the traditional publishing and then moved to independent publishing, where so many people's goals are to do it the opposite way. They want to do independent so they get their foot in the door and then move to traditional publishing. Whereas you're showing them that there is a different way. It it's better for you. And like you said, everyone's a little bit different, but it's just a completely different mindset that a lot of people, they maybe don't realize that when you go that traditional path, you lose a lot of your creative control. Like there is significant benefits to independent publishing.
I think once upon a time the dream was to get that book deal, the
Yeah.
big five, but
Yeah.
then with knowledge comes responsibility, I guess. And when I learned about how to get a book published, there's no way you're going to have an idea, write down a general manuscript, revise it for a month or two, and then think within a year that book's going to be out there. Just the sheer number, the volume of books that are going to be published traditionally, that's not going to happen. So I was like, well, I don't want to wait 5 years because I started
Hmm.
querying. I met with a lot of agents. I did the traditional path and I found myself changing areas I didn't want to change just to be accepted. I found a lot of agents, and this is their job. They look at you and say, this is the market. These are the books that are going to be sold. If I'm going to represent you and really pitch this idea, it has to align with the market. If you don't want to do that, that's up to you. And so I went and said, you know what? That is 100% fine. It's not like I'm trying to create a new career option for me. I'm still a scientist. I love my job. I love my life. This is just another part. If I'm a cube, this is just number two, number one through six is still here. And I don't need to cut off that part of me. If it means self-publishing or hybrid, so be it. It just didn't align with me rather than make myself fit into a paradigm that doesn't work. And
I
I know
love
that
that
that's
so
not the
much.
case for everybody. I know a lot of people don't want to do that. And that's
Well, we
wonderful for
all we
them
all
too.
see the new person like, oh, this person, their debut novel, New York Times bestseller, and those are kind of freak occurrences. And quite frankly, that's probably not that person's first novel. But that's
Yeah.
just the perception that we kind of have in general that if you are not immediately the best person in the world, you have failed. Whereas, honestly, this is my opinion, if I were to ever publish a book, I have not managed to actually even complete a manuscript yet, but if I ever publish a book and I had 10 readers that were not my family, I would consider myself a winner there. But, that's not the perception that everyone has, and that's not the perception that society pushes on us.
I think it depends on your definition of success.
Yes.
So if your goal is to sell millions of copies and the story isn't your own anymore, then you will succeed because you want to define that. I published my book, it's slowly making its way and finding its audience. Jade and Amber are kind of weird. Their family is interesting. And I like that they're quirky like that and they have their little idiosyncrasies. And that may not, and I know it probably won't land with a lot of readers, and that's okay because it's not supposed to. They're supposed to find their audience, and it works like that.
Awesome. So we kind of touched on this a little bit ago. Having an idea that you form a manuscript and go to market that fast. How do you know when you have an idea that should become a manuscript? Because I speak as someone who's had tons of ideas and I start to write them down. I'm like, this is not as good as I thought it was. Like, how do you know? Like, what's that defining moment where you're like, ooh, I have something, or ooh, this is not good.
For me, and I will preface this by saying for me, it's whether I can define an outline or a plot. I follow a three-act structure, regardless of the length of the story. So if I can find not only a beginning, middle, or end, if I can find an incident, where's the resolution going to be? If I can just plan that out with a paper and pen, I'll commit to that story. And I'll let you know there's a lot of stories that are in a vault somewhere that it was just this crazy idea of like, why not? Most of my stories come up like challenges. Like I dare you to write XYZ. as a short story or as talking to somebody, it's kind of funny, but to turn it
Hmm.
into an actual manuscript that's a minimum of 75,000 words that somebody would enjoy, that hits all the marks of an actual novel, it's not, it's a nice conversation. It's not a nice book. I have so many stories that are like that. I still write them down. I have what I call my bookshelf on my computer. There's a lot of short stories that are there. And ironically, what I find interesting is that a lot of these little stories that I make up, I actually find them in other books.
Really?
I'm listening to a book just for my commute from work and everywhere. It's called The Orphan Witch. And a part of the story is about this magical library and how it holds or encompasses the core of magic. And I thought of a mini story that doesn't necessarily fit that definition, but it was essentially about how libraries hold history. It's a magical entity, and there's a librarian in it. Librarians have a magical connection to a library, and libraries preserve history. And that's why they're important. I planned it out to like span hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was great until I wrote it out. And it was like, okay, so I've explained what a library is, what a librarian does. I know how the story technically ends. What about everything else? And it was like, okay, we're going to put that aside. And maybe in a few months, I can talk about it. I have my little buddies that we work through our stories, but it's there, it's on a shelf. It doesn't have to be written if it can't follow a plot, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Um,
The Orphan Witch by Paige Crutcher.
yes,
Okay. I just looked it up because it sounded interesting. I'm gonna add
I
it to my
literally
Goodreads.
just looked it up too. Immediately, just
I'm so glad that we're doing this because I found it just online. Like I've been listening to a lot of best-selling books, and while they're not terrible, it's like I want to listen to something different. I want a different
Hmm.
voice, a different prose. And so as I was looking, like I don't want a lot. I want somebody who's barely heard of it. I came across that and I'm listening to it. Like this is refreshing. Not
I
it sounds amazing. I also added it to my Goodreads.
I actually have Audible always sends out like, oh, 3 months for like $2. Okay. So I have a free credit, so I might be getting that one. We'll see. But yeah, I agree with you. Like specifically on my Audible, like I look for stuff that I wouldn't normally read a lot of the
yeah.
time. Like different stuff, different voices. And especially when you get a really good narrator, like that is just mm. And anyone who
Mhm.
says listening to an audiobook is not reading, I will fight you
I
because
will
I
also fight
like
them. Oh, okay. I get so
Get
upset.
out
I
that
live
emergency
through
light.
audiobooks. So, yeah.
yeah. I used to drive a lot and I would listen to a ton of audiobooks and they were fantastic. Um Man, I had another question for you, and you actually answered in that one. When you give up and shelve an idea for a while. Um, actually, Beatrice, what is your thought on, when you hit a point where a story should be continued into a manuscript or shelved? Because you're attempting the self-publishing path as well. So, what are your thoughts on that? Because I assume haven't just had two ideas in your life.
I have written so many things and completed way less than the amount of stories that I have started. And I have something very similar with Sarah is that I am like a chronicle outliner as well. I need to actually sit down and see things from like a removed perspective before trying to dive very deep in. And I have tried to do that. I've tried to be a pantser and I've tried to be like, well, let's see where this goes. It's the mystery. I can't. I get frustrated. I feel like nothing is happening. I feel like it just branches out too much and then none of the plots that were open actually have a closing. So I think only done it a couple of times with like that I had to go read everything, write down everything that is already written and actually create an outline from like that half story in order to see if it works or not. My experience is a very neurodivergent experience, and it's something that for years and years and years made me feel extremely guilty, which is especially because I am very used to publishing online as I write, because I grew up in Wattpad and like putting my stories out there. while I was writing. So I always felt that sense of responsibility with my readers that if they love the story and I realize that the story is not working, I have to keep writing it for them because I don't want to disappoint them. And it took me years to realize, and even therapy, that it's okay to leave a problem kind of like shelved and maybe recycle some ideas for that manuscript from that book, or just come look at it afterwards from a different perspective. Usually, the ones that I realize, and this is because of specifically how I am as an author, that are not working are the stories that are not very deeply connected emotionally to something that I want to transmit. I have tried to write stuff for ha-has and giggles. I have tried to write stuff like, could I write just something just like a high school romance and see what happens? Or maybe because that sells and all of that. But I find that like when I actually really have my author voice, I apologize, my bird is screaming a lot. When I really like have my author voice and I am able to connect with the stories when I am emotionally invested in the message that the story is trying to transmit. And if I am not connected to it, I can't commit to spending all the time and energy on it. And if I am already thinking about starting something else, and that is like where the therapy came in, like just I just do it. Now I just do it. I would try to write down ideas and shelve them and be like, not yet because I have to be organized and like do all of these things because I had already started. And then my therapist was like, why not? Like, if you're getting excited about a new idea and that idea is bringing you a lot of joy and it's going to bring you a lot of things that you can, bring a lot other people that are potentially going to read it joy, just explore that. You can always go back to the other story. So yeah, it's very chaotic. It's very unorganized. The only thing organized about my process is the outline because if I don't outline chronically, I cannot write. But it works with what gives me the bursts of energy that I need to write. And if that thing is not giving me that extra oomph in my excitement to write it, I learn to not force myself to commit to it.
Okay. Sarah, I do want to go back to one thing. You said that you had like some stories that you shelved that you then found in other books. Give us an example. Like, what's the most random one you've ever like you're listening or reading? You're like, oh man, I had this idea.
This, ironically, that this principle where I'll think of something and then years later, either somebody else talks about it, has been around since high school, right? And it's been a while. So, like, I remember I was in high school and we were talking about viruses, and like, you know what? That doesn't even make sense. You could just simply do X, Y, Z to keep it very non-scientific, and it's gone. And then I'm in my sophomore year in college, and they're talking about it's like a new viral agent. A quick example is the library idea that I do.
Hmm.
It's prominent in the Orphan Witch, where it's the thing that I'm most thinking about right now. And I was like, hey, now in the Orphan Witch, it is absolutely not like what I've thought
Hmm.
about. It's a magical library. It holds magical, I guess, articles through time, and there's a curse, and it's got its own story and plot. But my little short story that I wrote up, I sent it to my sister. She was like, okay, there's potential, but that's about it. You're gonna have to potential it a lot before it's anything. And I was like, you know what? I'm not feeling it. It was just an itch. I scratched it. This really cute idea that like what really preserved art and history throughout time were libraries, and librarians were the ones who went in the middle of like World War II, and they're taking all these pieces of art and they got caught. So the librarian wasn't able to get back to the library. And that's how a lot of artifacts were either stolen or
Hmm.
counterfeited. And so all was a nice idea. Again, I think it would have been great to talk over a networking session. When I put it down to paper, I guess I'm pretty sure somebody could make a story like this. The Midnight Library really resonates with some stories of that, where you're in this library and there's no time and you're cut off through the world and you just have to focus on one element at a time. I was like, hey, the Midnight Library. That's cool. Had nothing to do with the story that I originally wrote, other than it's a magical library and that there's a
Hmm.
librarian that's the caretaker of this magical entity. And it's just like, ah, look at that. I almost came into a book that's not even my own. Or with most of my books that I've been reading right now are witchly books, I would admit, just to keep my mind in the prose of what magical realism is. But I also listen to a
Hmm.
lot of fantasy, and they're just ideas of like a dragon, right? And especially with Onyx Storm coming out and everything. Like, I don't, when I sit down and write a story about a dragon, I wrote 2 years ago, but I wrote two absolutely nothing to do with all the dragon stories out there, but it still has a dragon in it. I'm like, see, if they just borrowed my little story, I feel like that would have been a really great plot twist. And it's just these little conversations I have with myself,
Hmm.
like, you see, I could have been a bestseller that way.
There is this book that I think will resonate with you a lot. It's another book that I really, really like, and I listen to as an audiobook. It's called Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. And one of the things that the book says is that ideas are living entities that are floating through space. And they casually sometimes you kind of like see them and you maybe like caress them a little bit and you kind of like grab in and you're like, maybe not the right time. And you put them back into the ether and then the idea finds someone else and then that other person grabs them. They're like, maybe I can give my own unique touch to this. And then they put them in their pocket and then they start using the idea. And that, like, she developed this concept because, like, she started seeing that it's like, oh, I had like a certain idea and I see it happening like in another part of the world. And it's the same thing with the person's unique twist, but I can see how this was kind of like the idea that I grabbed from the cosmos that maybe I wasn't ready to take full course, but this person was able to. And I don't know, I think you're really gonna like that. And I wanted to recommend you personally another book, which is I love reading. The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, which is the author of The
Oh,
Night Circus. Oh,
Night
I love
Circus
that
is one of
book.
my all-time favorites.
And Night Circus is amazing. It's also very recommended. The Starless Sea deals a lot. I almost don't want to tell you anything about how it is because everything is a very good surprise about the Starless Sea, but it deals a lot with stories and how they affect people and how they affect their surroundings. And it has a lot of magical realism on it. I am super passionate about magical realism too. And I really love that it's just like you feel very transported. Like you feel like everything around you has some sort of magic while you're reading the book. So I think you're really gonna like it. It's very fun, and
I
Erin
got it.
Morgenstern is a really good author.
I found it. We're gonna get it.
The Night Circus is one of those books that like I've read and is really good, but it is even better as an
I
audiobook.
was gonna say the narrator. Oh
Oh, it
my
was
God.
so good. Um, yeah, that was one of the books that like my wife and I don't always have like the same book taste, but that was one of the books that we're both like yes, and we recommended it to people. We've given it to people as
It's
gifts. Like this
amazing.
is a good book. And Erin Morgenstein or whatever her name is, I apologize because I probably just butchered that. She's only written like 2 books.
But they're both amazing.
Yeah,
That is definitely like quality over quantity.
yeah.
Because
And it's been a long time between each one, so you can tell she's taking her time and getting out what she wants and A plus work.
oh, so good.
I
All
love
right.
that. Quality over quantity.
Yes.
Everybody will
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah, there's definitely some authors out there that value quantity over quality. They're putting out new bestsellers every like 3 to 5 weeks. It's like you're not
Mm,
writing that. But
yeah.
well, and then now well, that's conversation for another day, the AI push. But um Sarah, we're kind of wrapping up here, so I want to ask one last thing of you. You said, in your time and your journey to get published, you've gotten a lot of advice. What is the best piece of advice you received?
So, the best piece of advice that I've ever received is to do it my way. Otherwise, I will definitely regret it. So, and what they meant by that is that they gave me some criticism. It was a developmental editor, and she gave me some criticism of my book. She's like, I don't even know how to fix this. It's my job to tell you that this is something they need to think about. And she was like, there's a lot of people who are going to tell you what you need to do to be successful, to get out there. You need to have a certain number of followers online. You need to be online all the time. You need to do this. You need to do that. And if you listen to them and you end up being successful, it'll be great, but it won't feel your own. It'll feel like it's borrowed or somebody else's path that you walk. Do it where you're comfortable, even if it's slower, even if you're not hitting all of those marks the way everybody else expects you to or thinks you should. But when you do it your way, it'll be yours and nobody can take it away.
Oh, I love that.
That's
That really,
amazing. That's so
All right.
eloquent. You're so great at explaining things. I would pay for like seeing a class from you for like anything.
We'll
You
work on that.
explain things beautifully, beautifully.
thank you.
All right. Well, Sarah, tell everyone where they can find you, what's your website, your social handles, where can the people find you?
So I am on primarily on Instagram, Avania 6x6. I can give that to you in writing
We'll put it
later.
in the description.
Yeah, my website is the Arcade, spelled with an H, and there is a long, hilarious backstory to why I spell arcade with a CH. .co. Etched in Stone is on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million. Google it. I'm pretty sure you can find it. It's the Etched in Stone with a green necklace. Because apparently there's another Etched in Stone about rocks.
I added that to my Kindle
That's
wish list
the
already.
the one about rocks sounds a lot less interesting than yours. So everyone make sure you pick up the correct one. So again, Sarah, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. We hope we get to talk to you in the future. Everyone check down below. We're going to put a link down there. Sarah has agreed to put a small something on StoryForge, so you can read some of her work. And to everyone out there, we will see you at the Forge.